mother left me when I was really small, before I could walk or speak, before I could have asked her to stay. She was gone for the first 5 years, when her touch mattered the most. The touch that said I was the only thing that mattered. The touch that made you feel all warm and safe. Sea dragons sound scarier than they look. They have no teeth and look really small. They don't even breathe fire, just water. They move really slow like seaweed and have bright colors like corals. This makes them very good at hiding. It comes in handy when you're running away from someone. Pacific sea nettles are like glowing heartbeats that want to swallow you whole. They can't see, but somehow they can figure out where to go. I wonder if they are drawn to anything, or if they could feel other jellyfish close by. Cow-nosed rays get really excited. They like to fly towards you. No one knows why they like to be touched. Maybe they like the heat coming from our bodies. All you have to do is put your hands underwater and wait, like for a really long time. Just a touch on their backs with the tips of my fingers and make all the difference. I need to find my mom.
Good afternoon and welcome to another edition of What We Should Know, coming to you from Cambridge Community Television here in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Today's program is going to be about Standing Rock, but also about questions involving veterans' activities generally, questions about the Trump administration and the reality that the president-elect believes that generals should be in charge of civilian government in the United States. There's been a long history of people with right-wing tendencies believing that the best way to run a government efficiently is to hand it over to the military. The United States has been in danger of being handed over to the military many times in its history, but never perhaps in such danger as it is today. So without further conversation, let's get an idea of the danger that we here in the United States are confronted with in having perhaps the Secretary of State and other influential positions in the government being taken over by generals. I've just arrived at the studio, so it's going to be necessary for me to take a minute just to organize 2 or 3 questions in today's program. So one of the important aspects here in the United States in reference to deciding on what government the United States will have and how this government is to function, a key question in the military interaction with the United States civilian organization is, what power does the military have in the United States as far as implementing the question of freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of worship, freedom of the press, and freedom for the redress of grievances. Those are 5 freedoms which should receive a maximum on protection in the United States, civilian government. But we recognize here in America that all of these liberties, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, right to redress of grievances, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, are continually in a process of being reevaluated. The fact that the current President of the United States, Barack Obama, initiated the National Defense Authorization Act, giving, among others, giving the military the freedom to arrest and indefinitely incarcerate any individual, any American whom they believe is plotting against the interests of the United States. The term used is not specific enough, but rather formulated in such an abstract way so that the military, were it to decide to implement the incarceration of Americans, could implement tens of thousands of Americans into detention, indefinite detention, without redress to the courts. The primary crisis in the implementation of the NDAA is the extension of the Guantanamo Bay decision. The decision to arrest enemy combatants, bring them within the jurisdiction of the United States, but not allow them access to U.S. courts and not allow them access to the judicial system within the military courts, but rather to provide an extrajudicial, so not within the military, but outside of the military courts, but under the military authority, so that the prisoners under this arrest as enemy combatants, it does not say enemy foreign combatants, it says enemy combatants. The NDAA would extend that specifically to include Americans. And that is basically what we will be looking at today. We will be looking at a discussion about the Guantanamo Bay and the new presidency, and we encourage our listeners to listen to this entire episode from why Guantanamo is still open, trade wars, or why Guantanamo is still open, the NewsHour Extra by the BBC. And we thank the BBC for the opportunity to replay this very interesting and factual discussion of those issues. So without further ado,
disciplinary process as an outsider critical of. Shot up in places like Iowa and crosses. And they saw both.
Maybe I've got two of them on at the same time.
It's not you. It's not you. It's
Okay.
the computer's settings have been tampered with.
Did they move the switch over here? I think there's a switch over here now.
No, the switch is on.
And Bob Ford for a senator from Tennessee, but now we're hearing some other names thrown out there.
Sounds like two programs over another, doesn't it?
China under Barack Obama, John Huntsman, he was a former governor of Utah, and John Bolton, who used to be George W. Bush's secretary to the United Nations, a real firebrand.
Can I close this or are you using this?
It's a diverse range
No,
of
I'm just
folks,
interested in
really
this one right here. I
wide
don't think
range
it's that one, but...
To the Bush administration that there could be war prisoners in this war called the War on Terror.
David Rifkin, you're in Washington, D.C. What's your analysis of the same question?
I agree with Carol. I would just add one thing. There's nothing
Can we get the
aberrant
volume?
about
Yeah, it's not correct because it's coming out of here. It's supposed to be coming out of
Oh, okay.
there.
As long as I can hear it, I imagine they can hear it at home, right?
Yeah, just not very well though. Not of the same quality.
entities that
I'll put this on here now and go see if Sean can help out.
Thank you.
and those organizations are enemy combatants. Every morning, people use enemy combatants, and if they were lawful enemy combatants, would be prisoners of war. There's an age-old concept of unlawful enemy combatants. There's absolutely nothing unusual about it, and the fact that it took the Obama administration a while to figure it out, well, I'll just say slow learning curve, but that's good. But I wanted to emphasize one point, that the whole debate to me about Guantanamo has always been misplaced. The people who are talking about Guantanamo as a place are missing the broader picture. To the extent you're going to hold captured enemy combatants, the ones we've captured, and maybe future ones, and I'll address it in a second, but we hold them in a Supermax facility or in the naval brig in Charleston or in Guantanamo. As a matter of locations, I'm sure Carol would agree that Guantanamo, as far as the facilities are concerned, is perfectly run. There's no prisoner violence. There are no abuses by the guards. The medical care is excellent. The food is excellent. I mean, I'm not saying it's a pleasant place to be in, but if you're going to be detained, Guantanamo is probably better than any facility in the United States. The real issue is, do we need the application, the utilization of a laws of war architecture that enables us to hold individuals with captures enemy combatants? If we do not use this architecture, we're not going to be able to prosecute this war properly, because applying the criminal law paradigm here would not work. Precisely for the reason that Carol mentioned, there are a bunch of people who clearly are going to go back to the battlefield.
Okay, we'll talk through all these issues, but that gives you your sort of opening position, as it were, and we will have plenty of chance to talk through what exactly those points you're raising. And General Leonard, when you started it, did you have a sort of view of how long it would be there for?
I felt it would be there much longer than the administration did. In fact, I had that conversation with several high-ranking administration officials that we better be prepared for the long haul. And I based that on the fact that I'd also commanded the Cuban migrant camps during the Cuban exodus from Cuba and then their subsequent pickup on the high seas. I think, though, that it's important that we understand why Guantanamo was selected. Places do matter, and Guantanamo was selected because administrations on both sides of the aisle. It's essentially an extra-legal area. I'm not aware, I acknowledge that, but it was selected, and in the words of Donald Rumsfeld, it was selected because it was the least worst place.
Right, and there was a sort of legal importance, which again we can discuss, in it being in Cuba, not on the American mainland. At Mozambique, you were there from 2003 to 2005. What sense did you have of how long you would be there?
I was born and raised in the UK. I've always understood the rights of habeas corpus, and I know that these have been exported to the United States of America, that it's within its constitution, that they are released. I didn't understand this category, that there would be enemy combatants or enemy aliens, as we were first described, where we wouldn't be given.
It seems to be coming out of here rather than there, yeah.
No charges against us, because there weren't any charges against us. Interestingly, when we were first taken into custody, we were all given in Kandahar enemy prisoner of war cards, EPW cards, which has extended to us those rights as prisoners under the Geneva Conventions, when they recognized that would afford us rights that we didn't have. They quickly removed those cards from us, and they gave us our cards, our numbers on blank cards. So this suggested to me that this is going to be a place that is outside the law, and everything that I've known about the law until now, forget when I saw that the FBI, CIA, military intelligence, and beyond were all involved, including my own government, including the British. I recognized that this would be something indefinite. Now, when I was sent to Guantanamo, I was told that this will be the but it was the beginning of a very long end, and of course 14 years on it's still open. Of course, the condition of being a prisoner in Guantanamo, you have to be a Muslim, you have to be rights, and everything that we understood before, the presumption for innocence was all gone, because now it was in the name
Best thing we do is restart the computer, but that's going to
Let's
control
get back to the issue of why it is still open. And to help us with that,
How long is it going to take to reboot?
who is the U.S. State Department
And
Special Envoy for the Guantanamo closure.
It will work then after that? Wow. So so the viewers at home are not hearing any of this, right? Oh, okay, great. Terrific.
So that's what do the restart, and then I should talk for 3 minutes.
Okay, sure, great. Great.
Decided to act during the president's first term to put in place a number of restrictions that made it more difficult for the administration to transfer detainees from Guantanamo.
So the discussion we're listening to for the viewers at home, it looks like the sound quality, we're only getting that here in the studio, and that the viewers at home are not getting the quality and the discussion of the BBC question about the enemy combatants and the continued use of Guantanamo Bay under the new administration. The discussion is with 4 experts on Guantanamo Bay. We'll be listening. We're rebooting the BBC program onto our network here at Cambridge Community Television. That'll take about 3 minutes, and then we'll start this program from the beginning. What we then will hear from the 4 experts are basically the differences in the positions regarding the necessity for Guantanamo Bay, the fact that or the belief by one of the contributors in the discussion that it's absolutely essential that the individuals who are at Guantanamo Bay should be kept there indefinitely without trial because of their dangerousness. They also believe that it wouldn't be possible to bring those detainees back to the United States because of their cruelty and their dangerousness, and it would not be possible to release them into the custody of another nation because of their potential to re-enter the battlefield. Another individual in the discussion makes the position that Guantanamo Bay prisoners are no different from any other prisoners, and gives examples of the Tsarnaev brothers in Boston, who, according to his take, were just as brutal and warlike and incorrigible as any of those in Guantanamo Bay. But a third idea on this is, if the Tsarnaev brothers were prosecuted under U.S. law and had the right of an attorney and were imprisoned in the United States, why shouldn't those in Guantanamo Bay who are equally dangerous then also receive the same type of trial under the judicial system of the United States rather than under the extrajudicial process of Guantanamo? So these are the ideas that are brought forth in this BBC program we're reproducing here with thanks to BBC, who broadcast this for the first time, I believe, on the 2nd of December in its NewsHour program. So just to come to a general synopsis of this, the crisis in the United States, as many individuals see it, is with the ascension of the right extreme movement in the United States and the appointment of a right extreme analyst and strategist to the chief strategist of the Trump administration, jettisons the idea of right extremism and the association of right extremism with military structures. The idea of militarism and right extremism are extremely narrowly defined and accepted. They bolster one another. The idea of militarism and the idea of hierarchical responsibility, exclusion of large numbers of individuals from the decision-making process, and anti-democratic idea is the right-wing exclusive position, an elite who make the decisions and exercise complete power over those who are ruled. This position within the Trump administration seems to be clearly accepted because of Trump's appointment of a number of generals into prominent positions of his administration, and in addition to that, the appointment of Steve Bannon, who is going to be chief strategist, or has already been appointed to be chief strategist of the Trump administration. We mentioned this in our program 2 weeks ago, what the position of a chief strategist has in a unit either of governmental decision-making or in private businesses. The individual who is appointed as chief strategist then combines all of the aspects of this unit and coordinates them, intercoordinates the positions so that the general functioning of the government or of this private entity is directed towards the end goals. And the end goals in this case would be the militarization of the United States government. If the plans of a right-wing extremist were to be given the opportunity to plan how the government was to function long-term. Thank you so much. So with this, without further ado, and with this introduction...
Put in your correct address.
I beg your pardon?
You gotta get to the right place.
Oh, you mean this page here?
Yeah, what was the page you were on that you're playing that audio from?
Oh, I'll have to type that in. Thank
Yeah.
you.
I got it working, so
Thank you so much.
just make sure it works before I go.
Yeah, got it. I think this is it, but I'm not sure I'll be able to get the tone. This is the one, but
Click that play button.
Please,
Again.
2 minutes.
There you go.
thank you.
This is Owen Bennett-Jones with News Hour Extra. Let me take you back
Thanks so much.
to the 22nd of January 2008. It was President Obama's second day in office, and he ordered in very clear terms that Guantanamo was to be closed down.
This first executive order that we are signing by the authority vested in me as President by the Constitution and the laws of the United States of America in order to effect the appropriate disposition of individuals currently detained by the Department of Defense at Guantanamo and promptly to close the detention facility at Guantanamo consistent with the national security and foreign policy interests of the United States and interests of justice. I hereby order. And we then provide the process whereby Guantanamo will be closed no later than 1 year from now. There we go.
1 year from now, he said, and it still hasn't happened, and we'll discuss why not and what the future holds for those detainees still left at Guantanamo. And to discuss these issues, I have, first of all, Carol Rosenberg. Now, back in 2001, she's a reporter on the Miami Herald, still is, and she was then told by her editor to cover the arrival of the first prisoners at Guantanamo and to report the story from start to finish. And 15 years later, she's still on it. And she has spent a remarkable 1,000 nights plus at the Guantanamo base. That's more than any other reporter, and has obviously followed every twist and turn of the story. We've got David Rivkin, who's a former associate White House counsel in the Bush Senior administration, and now a senior fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, and he's defended the practice of holding enemy combatants as a normal part of war. We have Major General Mike Leonard, now retired, who was the first commanding officer at the Guantanamo military prison. He led the Joint Task Force to build the facility. And we have Boaz Mbeg, a British citizen who was held at Guantanamo between 2003 and 2005 on the grounds that he was a member of Al-Qaeda, who'd been at Al-Qaeda training camps in Afghanistan. He's been investigated by the Americans and the British over many, many years, but never convicted in a court of law. He now lives in the UK. So let me just ask you, first of all of you, and Carol, can you start us off with this basic question? Obama said it'll be closed in a year, and still it isn't. Why not?
I think when President Obama first ordered the closure of Guantanamo, he had envisioned either trial or release, that they would charge the detainees who could be accused of crimes, and they would release those for whom there were no charges. But in the year that it took to study the files, he realized that there was a third category. Prisoners he wanted, that under the laws of war, he wanted to keep without charge indefinitely, what we call the forever prisoners. So closing Guantanamo became moving Guantanamo, taking the prisoners who would not be tried to a site in the United States and building what we call Guantanamo North. And Congress thwarted that effort. They've said, you cannot move these prisoners out of Guantanamo to the United States. You cannot transfer them, you cannot build on US soil, and they cannot be in any way taken to the United States, to include trial in federal courts or medical care. So what started off as trial or release became trial in some instances, move some to the United States, and release others. Now, in brief, he's succeeded to downsize the detention center by 3/4. He started with about 240 detainees there. As of today, there are 60.
And just to sort of clarify what you're saying a bit, because critics of his say he went wrong the moment he said, I'll do detention without trial in the US rather than in Cuba. And from that point on, it was never going to close.
Well, I think that he genuinely believed, as a former constitutional law professor, that you do not hold people indefinitely without charge. But as they dug through the files and took a look at these detainees, he came to realize that there was a kind of war prisoner they wanted to hold, someone who maybe did not conduct criminal activity or could not be convicted of criminal activity, but who, in the evolving view of the Obama administration, became similar to the Bush administration, that there could be war prisoners in this war called the War on Terror.
David Rifkin, you're in Washington, D.C. What's your analysis of the same question?
I agree with Carol. I would just add one thing. There is nothing aberrant about the notion that if you engaged in an armed conflict, and not sort of in a metaphysical sense, like war on poverty or a war on terrorism, but against specific enemy combatant organizations, Al-Qaeda, these days certainly other entities, that the individuals you capture that belong to those organizations, the members of those organizations, are enemy combatants. In every war you held people you captured as enemy combatants, and if they were lawful enemy combatants, would be prisoners of war. There is an age-old concept of unlawful enemy combatants. There's absolutely nothing unusual about it, and the fact that it took the Obama administration a little while to figure it out, well, I'll just say slow learning curve, but that's good. But I wanted to emphasize one point, that the whole debate to me about Guantanamo has always been misplaced. The people who are talking about Guantanamo as a place are missing the broader picture. To the extent you're going to hold captured enemy combatants, the ones who were captured, and maybe future ones, and I'll address it in a second, well, we hold them in a Supermax facility or in the Naval Brig in Charleston or in Guantanamo. There's a matter of locations. I'm sure Carol would agree that Guantanamo, as far as the facilities are concerned, is perfectly run. There's no prisoner violence. There are no abuses by the guards. The medical care is excellent. The food is excellent. I'm not saying it's a pleasant place to be in, but if you're going to be detained, Guantanamo is probably better than any facility in the United States. The real issue is, do we need the application, the utilization of a laws of war architecture that enables us to hold individuals we capture as enemy combatants? If we do not use this architecture, we're not going to be able to prosecute this war properly, because applying the criminal law paradigm here would not work. Precisely the reason.
So basically, to editorialize what has just been said by David Rifkin, who is a supporter of the Bush administration's policy, what we're speaking about, what he's advocating, is that another system of law be continued, the system of law initiated by the Bush administration at the inception of Guantanamo Bay, which is a process entirely outside of the legal process of the United States. That being that if an individual is accused of a crime, a violation of the United States law, that this individual is to be placed before a court to find representation for a defense of his position, and a jury to decide upon his guilt or innocence after the legal process. What Rifkin is supporting is that an entirely different process be put in place and maintained, one in which the military can determine who is guilty, and then this individual does not receive a trial, but is rather placed immediately on indefinite detention as an enemy combatant, and forever held, or held as long as the United States government wants them to be held. The problem with all of this is not only that that's a violation of the legal system of the United States, it's a violation of international law. And not only is it a violation of international law, The crisis then comes up with the initiation of the National Defense Authorization Act, which implements the exact same process against American citizens. In other words, if the military says that an American citizen is an enemy combatant planning against the government of the United States, they too can be incarcerated indefinitely without representation, without being having a trial, without having a defense. This is the crisis, and this is one that Rivkin does not want to speak about, but this is at the basis of this entire discussion. We continue.
Carol mentioned there a bunch of people who clearly are going to go back to the battlefield.
Okay, we'll talk through all these issues, but that gives you your sort of opening position, as it were, and we will have plenty of chance to talk through what exactly those points you're raising. General Leonard, when you started it, did you have a sort of view of how long it would be there for?
I felt it would be there much longer than the administration did. In fact, I had that conversation with several high-ranking administration officials that we'd better be prepared for the long haul. And I based that on the fact that I'd also commanded the Cuban migrant camps during the Cuban exodus from Cuba and then their subsequent pickup on the high seas. I think, though, that it's important that we understand why Guantanamo was selected. Places do matter, and Guantanamo was selected because it has been used by administrations on both sides of the aisle as essentially an extra-legal area. I am not a lawyer, I acknowledge that. But it was selected, and in the words of Donald Rumsfeld, it was selected because it was the least worst place.
Right, and there was a sort of legal importance, which again we can discuss, in it being in Cuba, not on the American mainland, as it were. And Mohsen Beg, you were there from 2003 to 2005. What sense did you have of how long you would be there?
I was born and raised in the UK. I've always understood the rights of habeas corpus, and I know that these have been exported to the United States of America, that it's within its constitution, that a person is either charged with a crime or that they are released. I didn't understand this category, that there would be enemy combatants or enemy aliens, as we were first described, where we wouldn't be given access to any legal representation. We wouldn't know the charges against us because there weren't any charges against us. Interestingly, when we were first taken into custody, we were all given in Kandahar enemy prisoner of war cards, EPW cards, which extended to us those rights as prisoners under the Geneva Conventions. When they recognized that would afford us rights that we didn't have, they quickly removed those cards from us and they gave us our cards, our numbers on blank cards. So this suggested for me that this is going to be a place that is outside the law, that everything that I've known about the law up until now, I can forget. When I saw that the FBI, the CIA, military intelligence and beyond were all involved, including my own government, including the British, I recognized that this would be something indefinite. Now, when I was sent to Guantanamo, I was told that this will be the beginning of the end of the process for me, but it was the beginning of a very long end. And of course, 14 years on, it's still open. Of course, the condition of being a prisoner in Guantanamo, you have to be a Muslim, you have to be a terrorism suspect, and you can't be a United States citizen. All of those three things are key factors into what brought people into Guantanamo and has allowed them to remain there. So rights and everything that we understood before, the presumption of innocence, was all gone because in the name of this new war, it was no holds barred.
Let's get back to the issue of why it is still open. And to help us with that, we've been speaking with Ambassador Lee Wolosky, who is the US State Department Special Envoy for the Guantanamo closure. And I asked him why President Obama had failed to keep his promise.
Well, as you know, we've made substantial progress toward the goal of closing Guantanamo. When the president took office, there were 242 detainees located there. There are now 60. We expect to further reduce that number in the coming weeks. Unfortunately, though, the Congress decided to act during the president's first term to put in place a number of restrictions that made it more difficult for the administration both to transfer detainees from Guantanamo, who we had concluded could be safely and responsibly transferred, and also to close the facility.
Right, so you're putting it all on Congress, but what would you say to the argument that President Obama lost this argument right at the start when he basically said, we will detain people without trials in the United States rather than in Cuba, and that he lost it then?
Well, we do have legal authority, as you know, both under U.S. and international law to detain enemy combatants during periods of hostility. And where the U.S. government has concluded, and this is 6 agencies and departments unanimously concluding that individuals no longer need to be detained, that we act to promptly transfer them to locations where appropriate security assurances can be put in place.
Yeah, but there are so many sort of holes in that, aren't there? You know, you sort of say they've all been cleared as non-threatening, and yet they still need to be held in security arrangements. And it does raise the question, I mean, do you reckon, looking back on it, that any people were put in Guantanamo who just shouldn't have been there?
Well, we have concluded that there have been cases of mistaken identity or cases where an initial thought about who someone was and what they did just didn't prove to be accurate. And that's really the reason for continued review.
But so can you then tell us about this number that the Defense Department put out, saying 5.6 of those transferred out had re-engaged in violent jihadism or terrorism. Is that a correct number?
I believe the percentage is just under 5% in this administration who are confirmed to have re-engaged in some manner, and it is not a standard that is proved beyond a reasonable doubt, and it doesn't mean necessarily that they have taken up arms. It just means that they are out doing things that they shouldn't be doing. And that is too high of a number, frankly, and we constantly work to reduce that number, but the risks of releasing detainees have to be measured against the risks of continuing to detain people who no longer should be detained. And in fact, another statistic that is worthwhile to remember is that the re-engagement rate was much higher during the previous administration. It was close to 20%. And of those individuals who re-engaged in the previous administration, almost half of them are dead or are in custody. So, you know, we try to be careful about how we proceed, but there are risks on both sides.
What do you think? Will it be there in 8 years?
No, it won't be.
That was Ambassador Lee Wolosky, and I want to just go straight to you, General Leonard, and get your response on this question of people going back to the battlefield, because it is at the heart, really, of this issue of why people are still being held. And when you hear those figures of the numbers who are going back to the battlefield to do something, and he's saying not very much in many cases, but to do something against the United States, what does that lead you to conclude about the rights and wrongs of release?
First off, you know, we've had 780 detainees incarcerated at Guantanamo. Of those, 678 were released. Some of those did go back to the battlefield, but many of those should never have been sent to Guantanamo in the first place. During the initial period of the war in Afghanistan, we were paying bounties for the pickup of potential suspects, $3,000 to $25,000. Well, in Afghanistan, $25,000, even $3,000 is a remarkable sum of money. And many of the people that were sent to Guantanamo were sent there simply because they had made enemies or were in the wrong place at the wrong time. That is a pretty low standard for locking someone up. Whether you apply the protections under the Constitution or those under the Geneva Conventions or those discussed elsewhere, it's just too low a standard. Would I demand a 100% certainty to their...
So that is part of the discussion for NewsHour Extra. Why is Guantanamo still open? We're thanking again BBC NewsHour Extra for this position. And we thank our viewers again on Cambridge Community Television here from Cambridge, Massachusetts, for the opportunity to play this very interesting discussion of various positions regarding why Guantanamo Bay is still open, what the importance is of having a facility which does not reflect the legal position of the United States within its territorial boundaries, but rather an extrajudicial one outside of the judicial practice of the United States, an extrajudicial practice in which the military of the United States has all of the cards. In other words, determines who is an enemy combatant, arrests them, kidnaps them, brings them back to Cuba, subjects them to, in many cases, to torture, puts them in a detention, then processes to find out whether or not they can be released, and if not released, then held indefinitely because of the continuing warfare the United States is having with these nations. This process is now continuing, began with the Bush administration, then a period of nearly 16 years ago, 14 years to be exact, and to be continued under the administration, apparently, of the President-elect Donald Trump, under the guise then of extending it through a decision made by the Obama administration under the National Defense Authorization Act. This is the question we're posing now. If the National Defense Authorization Act would be imposed against American citizens, our position is thousands, tens of thousands of Americans could be arrested and held in prisons similar to the one on Guantanamo Bay or in Guantanamo Bay without any kind of hearing in reference to guilt or innocence, and they would have no defense. They would simply be named as an enemy combatant and irreconcilably kept in Guantanamo Bay or an internal facility in the United States indefinitely. Thanks for joining us here from Cambridge Community Television here on What We Should Know on the 5th of December 2016. Join our program, What We Should Know, won't you, here in the future at the same time, 2 o'clock on Monday. Thanks again for joining us and have a great week.